All right. Thanks everyone for joining. Going to give folks a few moments to trickle in, and we'll get started with a quick introduction, show you guys some information for after today's webinar if you're looking for some more info, and then we'll go ahead and get started with today's CEU course. Today's course is brought to you by the Steel Tube Institute. We've got Victoria Owens, who's going to be on here presenting for us today. We've also got Rebecca Backer and Ryan Jackson here to help out and answer any questions. So really want to encourage folks to submit questions to the Q&A throughout today's presentation. We should have some time to get to some of those live, and if we don't get to your question live, we'll have a record of it so that we can follow up with you after today's event. Today's event is a CEU approved course. We did ask for AIA numbers upon registration. In case you're worried you didn't submit it, we'll also send over a form in the chat in a few moments so that you can submit your AIA number to us there as well as request a certificate. All right. I'm going to give everyone a quick introduction about some information that you can get on Acelab after today's webinar. So we're helping out with hosting today's event, and we've got a bunch of, looks like I froze a little bit. All right, I'm back. But we've got a bunch of free resources that you can check out. I'll keep the demo pretty brief, just want to kind of show you how to get in touch with Steel Tube. All right. So we're going to share a link to this in the chat as well, so that you can just jump to this page directly. If you're interested in learning some more about Acelab, we've got a ton of resources, searchable product categories, ways to use this for your firm. So I'll send over a link to schedule a quick free demo if you want to learn some more about all the other stuff we've got to offer. But today I just want to mention, you can use our platform to look up all sorts of brands and companies and associations, and get in touch with them directly to collaborate on projects, to talk through any questions that you have, and to learn some more about their company. So scrolling down here, you can get a bunch of great resources about the Steel Tube Institute, and you can also get in touch with their team directly. So this is a great place to come after today's webinar if you've got follow-up questions. We're also going to be giving you some opportunities to ask questions throughout today's webinar, as well as in a post-event survey. So tons of ways to get in touch and to make sure you get all of your information answered. All right, last thing for me, just keep an eye on the chat. We're going to be sending over a few helpful links through that, so you can grab those throughout today's webinar. Definitely feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A. We'll be keeping our eye on those. And I think that's it for me for now. Victoria, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today. Victoria, feel free to get started whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Yep, I will bring up my screen here. There we go. Looks okay? All right, great. Yes, so today we are discussing government initiatives driving low carbon products and operations. And this is a CEU, so I'm going to go over in detail the description and learning objectives needed for submitting for that CEU. So the goal of this course is a deep dive into the most recent codes, regulations, and assistance programs available to manufacturers. Today, especially, we're targeting steel. You will learn essential facts, data, and rulings about the Inflation Reduction Act, Build America, Buy America, the Federal Sustainability Plan, other regulations reducing embodied carbon, and more. So this course includes an overview of the most recent regulations in the industry, how they're affecting and providing opportunities to make change for manufacturers, and how specifiers can learn from manufacturers as well as collaborate with them during these times to reduce embodied carbon. And the learning objectives specifically are to discuss the current regulations and assistance programs to support manufacturers' embodied carbon reduction, review specific programs and approved and stated policies to increase reliance on domestic supply and increase the resilience of supply chains, as well as some rulings that are now in place. We'll identify opportunities for manufacturers and specifiers to connect as integrated partners. And lastly, apply strategies to discuss current sustainability regulations and the positive effects current and future generations will gain from green manufacturing practices and intentional sustainable specifications. And then you have here the course number, and attendees will receive an email confirmation of attendance from the Steel Tube Institute after this. And I also encourage you to take a screenshot of this slide, as this information is important for submitting the CEU. And I promise this is the only slide that I'm going to read directly from the slides. So now the CEU is officially starting. So I'd like to start with a glance at the overall timeline of some of the regulations we're going to cover that have been put in place as of today, and a few important milestones we know are coming in the future. So we have pretty much since 2021 is some of the regulations we're going to cover. As I mentioned, Build America, Buy America, the Federal Sustainability Plan, and an important executive order that lays out the federal government as a sustainability leader, also happened in 2021. And then in August 2022, we had the Inflation Reduction Act, which is widely recognized as one of the largest climate bills in American history, and certainly in recent history. Then in 2023, the state and federal Buy Clean initiatives became a little more clear. And specifically in 2023, the GSA announced $2 billion in available funding for low embodied carbon materials in the GSA federal building projects. Additionally, we saw in 2024, the SEC, this year, formally adopted carbon disclosure rules for public companies and public offerings. And then based on the Federal Sustainability Plan, we know some important milestones ahead are the targeting a net zero federal building portfolio by 2045, and total net zero emissions procurement for all types of procurement by the federal government in 2050. So in this section, we'll talk about reducing embodied carbon of construction materials, specifically through the Inflation Reduction Act. As I mentioned, this was a pretty aggressive and historic step towards lower carbon emissions, largely focused on renewable and clean energy. It's a way to meet Paris climate goals and move away from fossil fuels. So it provides for mostly tax incentives, new or modified tax incentives for all kinds of aspects of renewable energy, electric vehicles, and cutting edge technologies such as carbon capture and storage and clean hydrogen. So this has largely been a way to incentivize corporations and the private market, as well as public entities, to move towards these renewable energy and clean materials. I think also important to point out that it's estimated that more than 170,000 clean energy jobs have been created, and it ensures that these new jobs are high quality and good paying jobs by giving benefits to taxpayers who pay prevailing wages and meet certain registered apprenticeship requirements. It's also the EPA has estimated that the act will reduce US CO2 production from 2005 levels by 35 to 43% by 2030, in just 5 years from now. So this is a really impactful bill. And we also have a breakdown over on this slide of what's EESI is called carrots over sticks, the tax credits and incentive structure, and how it's broken down towards the different categories like clean electricity, electricity production, manufacturing, commercial energy, hydrogen, EV charging, etc. So you can see a little bit more detail about this here too. But I also want to specifically jump into the benefits to the building sector. So in addition to the tax incentives and credits that are provided for renewable energy, I mentioned the clean materials side of it. So the IRA invests over 50 billion into clean energy technologies and improvements. This largely towards allowing participants to lower their energy bills, um, to reduce pollution, as well as carbon emissions, to prioritize the delivery of new technologies, especially towards low median income communities, and working with organizations like Rewiring America. And with the overall idea just to make homes, workplaces, schools healthier and safer. Um, there's also an estimate by the RMI that the IRA could drive millions of retrofits, upgrades, and clean technology installations across homes, commercial square footage, and schools, as mentioned. So we also have here in this graphic, some of the potential impacts to the building sector. There's potential for electrification upgrades, home energy retrofits. Heat pump installations are a very popular one. I think a lot of people have latched on to that tax credit because it's easy to understand. So there's a lot of activity there, especially by residential homeowners. More emphasis on efficient homes when they're newly constructed, and the energy efficiency in commercial spaces as well, which is especially interesting as we're seeing some commercial spaces sometimes being retrofitted for residential, depending on the market demands. So I think the takeaway here is that, again, by RMI estimates, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act combined with the IRA could reduce building sector climate pollution by anywhere from 33 to 100 million metric tons, which is 10 to 30% of the way towards our 2030 goal to cut emissions in half. So talking specifically about some of the funding in the IRA for the building sector. I'm going to spend some time on this one because I think it's really going to be really interesting to the attendees. So one of the sections here, section 60112, this provides for $250 million to the EPA to develop a program to support enhanced standardization, measurement, reporting, and verification of embodied carbon. So specifically, this section is effectively in the form of grants and technical assistance to improve EPDs through data collection, transparency, how the process of an EPD, environmental product declaration, is created, et cetera. And I will talk more about that grant program in the next slide. But big chunk of funding there, direct funding in the form of grants, with a goal of effectively improving EPDs for primary materials, especially like steel. In the next section, 60116, 100 million has been earmarked by the EPA to develop a program to identify and label construction materials that have substantially lower embodied carbon, effectively lower than average. So this is an important program by the EPA to make it just easier for institutions to identify better than average embodied carbon products. And they're going to cooperate with the GSA, in charge of many federal buildings, and the DOT, in charge of many infrastructure products, on incorporating using this label in their projects. We have section 60503. which is a little over $2 billion in direct funding to the GSA for the goals around the federal buildings, which includes making those buildings net zero in terms of operating, in terms of embodied carbon, as well as for any procurement towards federal buildings. Then we have Section 60506, which is another about $2 billion to the DOT and Federal Highway Administration to directly reimburse or incentivize eligible recipients for the use of low embodied carbon materials in their construction projects. So again, funding set aside specifically for infrastructure projects by the DOT. In section 30002, we have over 830 million set aside for HUD, for direct loans and grants to improve the climate resilience of affordable housing. And again, that includes a component of low emission building materials. And then section 70006 is authority for FEMA to provide financial assistance towards the costs associated with low carbon materials. So I'm going to dive in a little bit to that grant program, the first bullet on the last slide. So the IRA, there's a lot, there's over 70 different tax credits covered and up to about 300 billion set aside for new and modified tax incentives to fortify clean energy and energy efficiency investments. Specifically, the grant highlighted here is targeted on the disclosure of embodied greenhouse gas emissions through the development of EPDs. And there have been 38 businesses and universities and nonprofit organizations awarded this grant to improve the data behind EPDs, to improve PCRs, the product category rules that EPDs are based on, to create tools and resources that make it easy to support and verify EPDs, and also just to turn it into a platform that's usable by industry. So I thought some interesting projects that received this grant money that I would mention would be the ICC for developing EPDs for Pacific Northwest steel. MIT received some grant funding for developing EPDs and EPD data specifically around steel reuse. And UMass Amherst also received some funding specifically targeted for EPDs for steel production in the US. And you can see here just, you could find some of the information that I'm mentioning easily from the announcements, the press release on this grant program, which we've copied here from the EPA if you're interested in more information. And so, yep, I jumped ahead on the projects here that have received funding, but here's some more details on exactly how much funding has been set aside for some of these projects that are adjacent or tangent to steel. And you can also see how the steel sort of slice of the pie of the categories for grant selection here. So just to talk a little bit more about embodied carbon in materials. As I mentioned, the EPA will be providing these grants in the form of technical assistance and tools to help many different organizations develop their lower embodied carbon materials. Yeah, I think if you have any questions about the EPD assistance section or the labeling section, definitely feel free to add those in the chat and we can talk more about them following this review. So to get into the details of what we mean when we say lower embodied carbon, and how certain projects can qualify for that qualification. This chart on the slide here, the table, lays out the specific global warming potential values, basically in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per ton, that are acceptable for meeting the definition of lower embodied carbon. And there's a top 20% limit, which basically is sort of the best of the best and the preferred target. And then if products that meet those targets are not available in region, then you can move into the top 40% limit. And if products that meet those targets are not available in region, then you can move to the better than average limit. And importantly, all of these values must be verified by a product-specific Type 3 EPD. And that's going to be important later. I'll talk more about it. So a construction product assembly can qualify for IRA funding if at least 80% of the assembly's total cost or total weight comprises steel that meets the requirements in this table. I think it's important to say really what these points are saying is that this lower embodied carbon requirement builds on top of the many other laws and requirements for federal procurement. It does not supersede them in any case. So all steel procured for the GSA projects must meet existing laws such as Buy American Act, Trade Agreements Act, and various other regulations that dictate federal procurement, but they will also be layering in this lower embodied carbon requirement for especially immediately GSA buildings and DOT infrastructure projects. Okay, so all that being said, just a quick view of how we see changes coming because of the IRA. And I think for one thing, we definitely expect updated state and local building codes. So the guidance and the example set here by federal requirements is likely to percolate through to more regional and local building codes and even potentially procurement requirements. One great thing about this is it is making it more cost effective to improve building materials. So there's that funding available to get organizations, institutions that are interested in making improvements over some of those early capital investment hurdles. It's likely to increase demand for green buildings, support the growth of the construction industry as this industry and the participants in it shift towards green building practices. And that's certainly especially going to affect hub industries of healthcare, hotels, education, and manufacturing. Infrastructure and cutting emissions will continue to be priorities. Certainly, that demand is going to be there from the private sector and kind of rolling from the bottom up, where customers are demanding that of the spaces that they're in, which feeds the demand of developers and builders, and which sets out the requirements of specifiers and procurement. And then additionally, there's sort of tangential activity and various pieces of legislation that are supporting this kind of funding, like the CHIPS Act on the technology side. And I think one thing that always has to be highlighted is how crucial it is to have skilled workers and skilled workers in these areas with experience or knowledge of green building practices. All right, so that sums up a bit about the IRA. So now I want to jump into the Federal Sustainability Plan and Executive Order 14057, which I mentioned earlier. Oops, sorry, jumped ahead. So this 14057 was an executive order signed in 2021 that's meant to reestablish the federal government as a leader in sustainability, affirm carbon pollution free electricity sector, and net zero emissions economy wide targets by 2035 and 2050, respectively. Laying out here some of the sectors and goals covered by the executive order. The idea being that it's a whole government approach, and it aims to let the U.S. demonstrate innovation and environmental stewardship, as well as safeguarding investments against the effects of climate change and really emphasizing resilience in the face of natural hazards and other effects from climate change, um, and focus on expanding technology and industry and jobs through a focus on sustainability. I'm going to move just to the overall plan here. So this kind of demonstrates how many different areas the sustainability plan and this executive order covers. So talking about everything from electricity generation, carbon pollution and emission-free electricity generation, zero emission vehicle targets, an important one, net zero emission buildings by 2045, including a 50% reduction in emissions from buildings just in 2032. So really accelerating that target. And also total net zero emissions procurement for all federal projects by 2050. So those are two I really want to hit on and go into detail further, but also mention the net zero operations targets as far as government organizations, climate resilient infrastructure and operations, so taking into account the anticipated effects of climate change, development of a climate and sustainability focused workforce in support of all these initiatives, advancing environmental justice, and accelerating progress through domestic and international partnerships on the sustainability plan. So talking more about the net zero emissions aspect of the executive order, the idea here is to leverage public-private partnerships to modernize federal buildings with a goal of advancing the agency's mission, again, creating good paying jobs and cut greenhouse gas emissions associated with buildings, especially from one of the largest building portfolio holders in the US as the federal government. So, and I think emphasis here on partnership with the private sector to upgrade existing federal buildings. So that's where the procurement requirements and the product clean labels, for example, are going to be important in taking advantage of those increased public-private partnerships. And this is just a bit about the press release for this particular item as well. And the Federal Building Performance Standard, which is going to feed into the ability for those agencies to meet the net zero emissions target. And this building performance standard is the kind of thing that's going to get incorporated into probably state and local building codes. And then another really large impact area out of this executive order has been the federal Buy Clean Act, which specifically targets this net zero emissions procurement by 2050. In summary, I mean, we have here kind of a timeline of the many aspects of an evolution of the Buy Clean Act, but in summary, it's a policy to promote the purchase of construction materials and products with lower embodied greenhouse gas emissions, and making sure that that policy takes into account total life cycle emissions associated with the production of those materials, knowing that today the US manufacturing sector is responsible for nearly a third of US greenhouse gas emissions, and specifically the production of steel, concrete, asphalt, and glass account for nearly half of that. So talking a bit more in detail about federal net zero emissions procurement, there has been a task force put in place, co-chaired by the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer and White House Office of Domestic Climate Change Policy, which also includes representatives from Departments of Commerce, Defense, Energy, Homeland Security, Housing, and many more. And this CLEAN task force develops recommendations on policies and specific procedures to expand the consideration of embodied carbon in federal procurement. So they are taking actions like identifying construction materials with the highest embodied carbon, as I mentioned, that's steel, concrete, asphalt, and glass, flat glass specifically. They have committed to prioritize lower embodied carbon products in federal procurement processes, and federally funded projects, even if they're not specifically federal projects. They also have a goal to increase transparency through supplier reporting of EPDs, environmental product declarations. And this task force will be launching pilot programs to boost federal procurement of cleaner construction materials, and collect more information about the performance of those materials in real world applications. We also have a little bit about the Buy Clean Partnership. So it's a partnership with 12 leading states committed to prioritizing efforts to support procurement of low embodied carbon materials in state-funded projects as well. So those states would be California, Colorado, Hawaii, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, and Washington. And also later, Minnesota signed on to that partnership. So these states have agreed to lean into this partnership, and the U.S. Climate Alliance is also supporting policy, technical, and analytical assistance for participating members for their state level Buy Clean efforts. And then just to say again, just wanted to include here some of the language from these initiatives, how they specifically call out steel, and emphasis on job creation and high quality job creation, and the support of American manufacturing specifically, of course. So then additionally, there's another rule proposed in the form of the Climate Risk and Resilience proposed rule, which was proposed, but I think has not been adopted. But it would require it's still in consideration and would require major federal contractors to publicly disclose their greenhouse gas emissions and climate-related financial risk. So this kind of ties into the SEC ruling that we'll talk about later, but basically it's showing that the federal government is kind of leading the charge and pushing for this from their contractors and suppliers, even in the absence of public reporting requirements prior to the SEC rule going into effect. The idea is that would strengthen the resilience of vulnerable federal supply chains with a goal of greater efficiency and reduced climate risk. But it does also, there's exceptions for contractors with less than 7.5 million in annual contracts. So jumping a little bit more into some of those state Buy Clean initiatives. So I mentioned that there are many states that have signed on in terms of mutual commitments. And jumping into some of the specifics of what those look like at the state level. Many of these participating states have passed their own Buy Clean legislation, with California primarily leading the way. But these state commitments reflect the language and the intention of the federal Buy Clean example. So here's kind of a visual, since I kind of rattled off a list of states. These are some of the states that have signed on to the Safer States Alliance. So many states are thinking about these Buy Clean activities. In this case, it's ones that are taking action on toxic chemicals and plastics. This is a view on states that have greenhouse gas targets, whether in the form of statutory or executive targets. These are the states with the climate action plan. Generally, that covers greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and detailed actions the state intends to take to meet those goals, as well as, in many cases, resilience strategies, clean energy targets, economic, social goals related to climate action. So there's a total of 33 states that have released a climate action plan here or are in the process of revising or developing one. And then along with kind of the Buy Clean emphasis, there are several states that have actually enacted carbon pricing policies, typically implemented through, we're talking about cap and trade or carbon tax outright. And so these are some of the states and the type of carbon pricing they have in effect. So then I want to talk about Build America, Buy America. That was actually the first regulation on the timeline that we looked at in the beginning. So this was originally implemented in 2021. To talk more about that, this is an important highlight, so I'm going to read it outright. Build America, Buy America Act requires that all of the iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials used in infrastructure projects are produced in the United States. Infrastructure projects covers things like roads, bridges, dams, any kind of construction project for the public good. And this act from 2021 set out a goal that all materials, and especially the iron, steel, and manufactured products and construction materials used to build them be made in the United States. companies can comply and report on Build America, Buy America through self-certification. And there are certain waivers available for electronics, but overall, the goal is again to fuel job creation, boost economic resilience, boost American sector manufacturing, um, and empower local businesses. So then there's here the Made in America office, which covers waivers for the Made in America laws and make sure they are applied clearly and consistently and transparently. Um, it also, I think importantly, it aggregates the information it gathers from the waiver submission process to understand where, in what types of products and industries waivers are often needed, and then being able to focus on that sector of manufacturing to hopefully support U.S. ability to meet those manufacturing needs and make a more resilient supply chain. So there's an aspect of market intelligence, centralizing information, and maximizing opportunities for U.S. producers to supply goods and services to the federal government. Okay, so then the last topic here is the most recent SEC carbon disclosure rules. And so this was, as mentioned, just in March of 2024 this year, where the SEC has formally adopted a ruling to ensure that public companies going through public offering, incorporate climate risk disclosures into their typical disclosure filings. That's really been driven by investor demand. You know, that the finance industry has clearly indicated that they want this information. They recognize that there are risks to businesses from climate change, and those risks should strategically be identified by companies and disclosed, just like any other kind of risk would be in typical company filings. Oops, sorry, jumped ahead there. So just to kind of go over what's included in the final ruling that's been adopted. So they adopted a formal amendment stating that registrants, effectively public companies or companies interested in a public offering, must include climate-related information in their registration or annual reports. Some examples of the disclosures required would be climate-related risks that could impact business strategy, operations, or financial condition. If you're following the news, insurance markets in Florida would be a pretty good example of climate-related risk to business operations and financial condition. And then lastly, audited financial statements as well would have to include disclosures on severe weather events or natural conditions that could affect the company business. So this is a bit more on the detail of the ruling that's effective now and the compliance dates. So the rule has been formally adopted. The SEC has said this climate disclosure is required, but the timeline for companies to be able to collect that information and start incorporating it into their formal reports typically is starting in financial years that begin in 2025, and then going all the way, potentially for some of the deepest requirements and most specific disclosures required around greenhouse gas emissions. Companies might have all the way until 2033, at least this is the, in terms of the current compliance dates required. So we covered many different regulations from government initiatives driving low carbon product and operation, from Build America, Buy America, the Executive Order 14057, Inflation Reduction Act, one of the largest, state and federal Buy Clean initiatives, and the SEC rules. So that concludes the formal component of the CEU on government initiatives. Then I do have a couple points about specifics for STI. So I'm not sure if it's okay to just jump to that, or do we need to pause the recording or anything?
Yeah, no, I think it's fine to just jump to that. And
Okay.
just for any folks who might have some questions, feel free to submit those in the Q&A, and if we have some time, we can get to those as well.
Yeah. So some specifics for STI out of this. I mean, it's going to be important to set emission reduction goals for your products, and it's going to be important to measure the current emissions and any emission reduction progress through EPDs. Especially, yeah, the government has put a lot of emphasis on that, on EPDs as the tool to communicate the benefits of, benefits and progress towards lower embodied carbon in products. There are, I think, some members, it looks like, of STI that do have EPDs. Also, the HSS has an industry-wide EPD. But as I mentioned in a few of those, the details of especially the IRA funding, there are some instances where a product-specific EPD is required. So keep that in mind if you're interested in pursuing any funding associated with that. And it's going to continue to just provide enormous value to have sales teams informed about all these aspects and opportunities of sustainability, purchases and incentives and the motivation towards more sustainable products. And there are some potential lobbying efforts to consider around bills that consider low carbon materials, and efforts to support document transparency, like the EPD assistance or labeling programs that are out there, and how STI can participate in the development of those.
And then I can add it now that we're outside of the formal CEU. So as Victoria mentioned, for those of you who are interested, if you go to the Steel Tube Institute website on the hollow steel section side of things, there is, as Victoria just said, an industry-wide EPD available for use. But then on the steel conduit side, there are product-specific, manufacturer-specific EPDs that are currently available and are also in progress from a lot of the steel tube manufacturers who are members of the Steel Tube Institute. So as noted here, you'll find EPDs from Nucor and Atcor. Again, those are currently published and available, and there are additional steel and other material type conduit EPDs coming soon. So make sure you check the STI website and the member company website to keep tabs on those. And then again, as Victoria mentioned, the Steel Tube is also involved in a lot of lobbying efforts on a number of the bullets that are listed here, as well as working to promote the use of US made steel over foreign steel. So I do believe these are available on the website, but we have done previous webinars with Acelabs that are, they're not AIA CEUs, but they are webinars on both just the LCA EPD process in general, as well as the carbon footprint of US steel versus foreign steel, where more often than not, US steel is going to have a much lower embodied carbon than foreign competitive steel. So just additional resources to note and different actions that the Steel Tube Institute has been working on. So they're coming at this from a number of different perspectives.
Awesome. All right. Well, it looks like we don't have any other open questions currently. So if y'all have any questions, feel free to leave them in the post-event survey as well. There's also a quick poll up where you can leave any questions you've got there. We'll go ahead and connect you with the Steel Tube Institute team directly so you can discuss that further. Last thing before we jump off for the day, just want to remind folks to grab any of those links from the chat that you might need. We've got a link to the Steel Tube Institute on Acelab. You can also navigate to their website from that page as well as a link to schedule a free demo with Acelab if you want to learn some more about any of our other free resources. All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Victoria and Rebecca, for a great presentation. We appreciate it. And thank you, Ryan, for being on board here today as well. All right, awesome. I hope everyone has a great rest of their Thursday. And yeah, we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you so much.